Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin, and today I want to share a Bigfoot report I received some time ago, and this one gave me the creeps like no other. Here it goes. Hi Bob, my Bigfoot encounter doesn't feel like a normal Bigfoot encounter, or at least, nothing as simple as bumping into a large animal. I grew up in almost Idaho, in Montana, outside of Missoula, and I was raised by my dad. My mom left us when I was a baby. Dating the first event is easy because it happened on my 14th birthday. So if I was 14, then I guess it was 1975, because I was born in 61. We were poor, not dirt poor, mind you, not even poor, just poor, so I wasn't expecting anything special or a party, maybe just a nice dinner and a new coat or something. But when my dad picked me up after school, as soon as I got into the car, I immediately noticed that something was weird with my dad, like he was agitated. And he spent the 20-minute drive lecturing me about these new rules. No going outside alone, no going outside at night, and weirdly enough, we're to keep the blinds shut. Naturally, I asked why and what happened, seeing as this was totally out of character for him. And he seemed to have trouble explaining himself. He said something about a bear, and we were surrounded by farmland, so bears were not a common thing there at all. But at some point in the explanation, the bear somehow morphed into a drifter who looked like he was up to no good. And I remember thinking, well, which is it? A drifter in the woods or a bear? Or were the drifter and the bear in cahoots? Anyway, we stopped for a rare second lunch. That's what we always called it, when we'd stop for food after school, for a meal before dinner. My dad had calmed down and was apologizing for forgetting all about my birthday, which I knew was nonsense. In fact, I suspected that the second lunch was a stall tactic of some sort, and after ice cream and fries, he apologized for being uncharacteristically testy. Again, I asked what happened, because it was quite obvious that something did. And he said that he caught someone on the farm, and that they looked like they were up to no good, and that we had to be vigilant for a while. Now, honestly, that didn't really set right with me. I did not find the answer satisfactory. But at the same time, it didn't seem like all that big of a deal because my dad was always worried about me. And just as I suspected, when we got back to the house, there was indeed a little surprise party set up. The surprise aspect was a nice effort, but we parked in front and went in through the front door, which we never did, mysteriously avoiding the back of the house where cars might be parked. I looked at him fondly and he just shrugged. Even though my mom left when I was a baby, her family was still a big part of my life. Which is one of those things that I totally took for granted as a kid, and now looking back as an adult, I'm overwhelmingly grateful for. I didn't think much about it at that age, but it was like my dad had two sets of parents. He was only 17 or 18 when I was born, and he had to grow up fast, and I'm sure he appreciated the help. Anyway, the night was nice. My cousins were, and are, hellions. I had recently made the grievous error of telling them that I was afraid of snakes, so they did everything possible to incorporate them. But at some point, my dad and my grandfather, my mom's dad, must have slipped away and had a discussion, because my dad and I spent the next 3 nights at their house, which wasn't all that unusual, because they actually lived closer to school than I did, and I've stayed there before, so it wasn't really a big deal. But looking back, I'm sure it was related to the drifter bear. We came back to the house in a few days, on a Sunday, and other than Dad being more vigilant than normal, nothing really changed. I can't recall anything unusual happening for 2 years, and I totally forgot about the drifting bear. That is, until one hot summer night. That night, I was 15 or 16, and I was lying in bed at about 11 p.m. when I noticed the porch light turn on. Light came in through my window, because my bedroom was on the first floor, and the window was on the far side of the porch. And I clearly heard the distinctive thunk of the light switch being flipped. I was half asleep, so I didn't really think much about it. Then it went off with another thunk. And then it turned on again. Back then we lived in an old farmhouse. And I don't know if the house's age had anything to do with it, but it was the type of house where you could basically hear anything from anywhere. And as the light slowly strobed, I rather suddenly became alert as I realized how atypical this was. I definitely would have heard my dad get up and walk down to the porch, and I knew it couldn't be the bulb being half burnt out or something, because I could distinctly hear the switch being flipped. I don't know how long this went on, probably a minute, maybe 2. The light would come on for maybe half a second, then go off, and then go on again, sometimes slower, sometimes faster. I must have been half asleep when I first noticed it, but after a minute, or however long it was, I became certain that something was wrong, and I got that sinking feeling in my stomach from when adrenaline hits. I was just very still in bed, listening intently, but there was nothing at all to hear except the soft sound of thunking, and nothing to see but the light going on and off through my window. I got out of bed, and I was a master of moving silently on those rickety wooden floors, so I was going to stealthily investigate, when all of a sudden I heard this low-pitched sound that I'll never forget. It started like a wop-wop, but in the same breath mutated into some kind of warbling giggle that grew deeper and deeper until it finally crescendoed into what I can only call a screaming laugh. And I just froze beside my bed, terrified. This was so loud. Now, I can't say I've ever been near a roaring lion, but I imagine that's what it was like. This was ridiculously loud. Mind you, the sound seemed to come from inside the house, more so than it came through the window. I guess I mean to say that it sounded like it came more through the door than from the bedroom window that faced the porch and the side of the house. No, I didn't scream, I didn't run, I didn't move at all. And looking back, I consider this to be the first time in my life that I recall entirely being taken over by instinct. I froze like a deer. I don't think I could have moved if I wanted to. I think on a deep primal level, that was my instincts telling me to not draw any attention to myself. In that moment, I felt exactly like prey. And before the laugh even ended, I heard my dad charging out of his bedroom and down the stairs. A noise I've heard 1,000 times, but not once with this urgency. It almost sounded like he had boots on, but I could tell he didn't. His bedroom was the only room upstairs, and it was one of those houses where the second floor is more like an attic between the eaves of the roof, and the only bathroom was downstairs. So obviously I've heard him come down those stairs 1,000,000 times at night, and this was not like any of those times. So he comes charging downstairs, and I heard him shout the word down, so I dove under the bed. And the stairs to the second floor led directly to the front door, so he would have been able to see the front door from 2/3 down the steps. I'm smiling as I'm writing this because even 40 years later, I can remember the exact sound of my dad taking those steps. Aside from this instance, it's a fond memory of mine, because it meant my dad was nearby. But from under the bed, I heard him pause with maybe 2 or 3 steps left to take. I knew he stopped with 2 or 3 steps left because I didn't hear him hit the landing, which had a different sound than the stairs. And this I'll never forget. My daddy cursed, the SH word. Now to be clear, my dad was known to swear on occasion, but I'll never forget this because it had 2 distinct syllables. It. I don't know why, but that always stuck with me. He turned it into 2 words, which I'd never heard before. He must have been holding his 12 gauge because he shot from inside the house, and it shot through the door. Then I heard him leap, clearing the landing altogether and landing by the front door, and I heard it swing open. So my dad was on the porch now, and then I heard 2 more shots. And my dad was shouting basically jargon, just like one would when trying to scare off an aggressive bear. And I'd never heard my dad, or any adult, make noises like that. Just nasty yells of aggressive jargon. Then the door to my room flies open, and I know it's my dad because I heard him coming. And as soon as he turns the light on, he makes this devastated gasping noise, because he thinks I'm gone, because I'm tucked under the bed. So I tell him I'm right here, and I clamber out, and I'll never forget the relief on his face. I'm a parent and grandparent now too, and I can tell you with certainty that that's love right there, when you think your kid is gone and then you find them. Which is why I never let my middle son go to Walmart ever again. Anyway, he shepherded me into the living room, and onto his favorite chair, which I literally never sat on, because it was unspokenly his chair. But looking back, I realized that it was up against an interior wall, as in, not against or near any windows. Obviously, I asked what the hell was going on, and here's another thing about that weird night I'll never forget. He said, I don't know, my sweet little kolachki cookie. And moments later, he called me, quote, my pudgy potato pierogi. Few things about that. First of all, I was a very thin child, so I don't know where pudgy came from. Though perhaps even more strangely, I am not Polish, and no one in my family is. And a day before these utterances were made, I would have bet $1 that he couldn't identify a kolachki or a pierogi, seeing as he didn't watch cooking shows, and the extent of his home cooking was steak and baked potatoes. So I have no idea where that came from. Maybe he was dreaming about food. I think his brain just vomited those phrases out in a word salad produced from the relief of knowing I was okay. My dad called the police, and I talked to them too. And I was there the whole time. I think my dad wanted me to be part of it, to add credibility to the story, even though I hadn't seen anything, but I sure as hell heard it. And I don't know why, but at some point when my dad was talking to the cops, and I had kind of zoned out, is when I realized something about what happened. So, our porch lights had 2 switches. One outside on the side of the porch by a couple outlets, but the other switch was inside, beside the front door. When I was in bed, I guess I had assumed that it was the outside switch being messed with, because I hadn't heard anything inside the house. Well, it had been a hot summer's night, and all the windows had been open, and it turns out that the whatever it was had somehow removed the screen from the window by the front door, and had placed it up against the wall, right below the window, and had reached inside through the window, and was flipping the light switch that was inside the house. It's still a complete mystery how it opened the screen without breaking it, because the screen had 2 little pull tabs on the side, but they were only accessible from the inside, and the tabs were in the position to indicate that they were locked. Later, my dad and I would spend hours trying to remove the screens from the outside without breaking the screen, or disengaging the little tabs, and it simply wasn't possible. The fit was extremely tight, and it would break before it would bend. The only explanation that makes sense is that the pull tabs were in the open position, and that things simply could have leveraged the screens out of the window and then moved them to the closed position once he had access to the little levers, but that doesn't make sense either. So my dad was unaware of any of this happening until, of course, the screaming laugh, at which point my dad came flying down the stairs, and halfway down the stairs, which he had to stoop down to see, he said he saw a big hairy arm withdrawing from the window, and he saw its face looking in through the little window in the door. He only saw it for a moment, but he called it, quote, a devil face. He could only see its eyes and the bridge of the nose, but he said it looked like the devil, and mad as hell. He said it looked evil, and he got a good look at it through the little glass window on the door. He didn't see much of it, but what he did see, he saw well. And that's when he shot, right through the door, below the face where its chest should have been. And he ran onto the porch, and that's when he started to yell, and he fired 2 more shots from the porch. But he didn't have sight of the creature by then, which is why he thinks that it jumped over the railing and went around the side of the house. We would have heard it if it ran across the porch, so we think it jumped over the railing first, ran around the house, and then circled back. The front of the house was flat and bare, and the night was bright enough to have seen it if it had gone straight for the tree break. He ran around the whole house in his undies, screaming like a banshee before he came back in to look for me. So outside, he shot to give the impression that he meant business. And it wasn't until he returned to the house that he realized that there was no blood on the porch. No blood, footprints, or hair either. He was utterly perplexed on how he hadn't struck it with his first shot. He was quite certain that he'd hit it when he first pulled the trigger. In movies, they always show shotguns as blasting holes through walls. But that's not what happened here. There was just a series of small holes close together right in the door frame. The cops were very straightforward. They said that they're not filing a report, and that these things don't usually bother people, and that we should just leave them alone. I remember that very specifically because my dad went off on them. He said, usually? Oh, they don't usually bother people? The only thing that I really remember about the cops was that they were excited about the thing's size. They tried to recreate it multiple times, to flip the switch through the open window, with their head visible in the little window on the door, and it wasn't even close to possible. My dad could barely get his whole hand flat against the door, and when I tried, I couldn't even get my elbow to the window while keeping my line of sight through the little glass pane on the door. Another thing about its size that my dad insisted upon was that he and the cops had to cock their heads more than the creature did in order to angle their elbow through the open window. My dad said that the creature's head wasn't straight up and down, but it was far less at an angle than when he or the police tried. One of the cops was a bear of a man, and he could get his arm in the window with his head straight, but his hand barely made it to the center of the door, and certainly not to the switch on the other side. My dad told the cops that it was too big to fit in through the window, but it could have busted through the door easy as pie if it had a mind to. I know this doesn't really fit into the mindset that a lot of people have about a Bigfoot cover-up or whatever, but I was there, and I specifically recall the cops saying, "We're not filing a report. We get a few calls like this every year, usually from the same people. Just let it alone." And one of the cops told him that they don't come inside houses, and that's when my dad told them to get off his property. And after they left, My dad and I had ice cream, and he told me about what happened 2 years ago on my 14th birthday. But you should know this first, I guess. The previous owner of the house raised hogs there, and there used to be this wallow right on the side of the house that was so filthy that my dad filled it with rocks and charcoal, and then dumped a dump truck load of sand over it. And we called it a sandbox, just because my dad and I played in it a lot when I was a kid, but it was really just a sandy patch of yard. Anyway, on my 14th birthday, while I was at school, my dad was coming up the driveway when he saw a black figure in the sand pit. At first, he thought it was a wayward hog or something, but as he got closer, he saw it was human-shaped, only much larger, somehow both lankier and stouter than a person. Its position was peculiar. He said it was on its knees, pulling sand towards its chest, simultaneously digging a hole and making a mound. Dad didn't have a gun on him or anything, and he just kept driving toward the house, trying to figure out what he was looking at. Dad said his first thought was that it was a man in bearskin, but that hypothesis didn't last long, and as soon as he got close enough to see that it was absolutely nothing he'd ever seen before, he drove straight at it and laid on the horn, and it sprang up and ran to this tree line that serves as a windbreak there, and it followed the break all the way to the woods, screaming the whole time, a much higher pitched and shrill noise than you would think a creature that large could make. Dad said the thing galloped like a horse. That's a good question. Looking back, I don't know if he meant it ran like a horse as a reference to speed, or if it actually ran on all fours. I took it to mean that it ran fast and fluidly, but now you've got me wondering. He described it as a goblin. He said it had no ears, a bald head, but hair around the sides like a balding man. Its skin and fur was jet black. It had impossibly long arms, impossibly broad shoulders, a big butt, shovel-like hands, a small head, thin lips, a wide mouth, and he said it had deep creases running across its forehead. He said it looked annoyed, like it was unhappy to be bothered, like it wanted to flee, but really wanted to finish whatever it was doing before leaving. Dad called our closest neighbor, who lived about 1/4 of a mile away. I guess the neighbor had on occasion asked my dad very strange questions that hadn't made any sense until the sighting. My dad told him exactly what he saw, and I guess the marks in the sand were pretty compelling too. This neighbor was super religious, the scary over-the-top kind, and he wasn't surprised by my dad's statement at all, and he said that they'd been having issues at their place too. And he said that he even called the police after one of them broke into and then apparently spent the night and defecated in a tractor. He said that a little one stole clothes from a clothesline and has been wearing his wife's sundress for about a year. He said he'd called the police multiple times, and that half the time they told him the same thing they told my dad, and the other half of the time they gaslighted him. So my dad and this neighbor guy, who was 30 years older than my dad, poked around the pit, and they found a bunch of stuff under this mound. And I guess this is what freaked my dad out the most. The mound wasn't random. It was burying stuff. Among the contents there, he found several magnets that used to be on our fridge, along with a little notebook we used for grocery lists. We had never noticed that they had gone missing, so who knows when they were taken. These items were all within reach of the kitchen window, assuming you had a very, very long arm. There was also a photo of me. It used to be pinned inside my dad's truck, and he said he never noticed it was missing. But the weirdest thing, to me, that he found buried in the sand were all the angels. There were 12 different depictions of angels. Some were little stone or ceramic yard ornaments. Some looked like Christmas tree decorations. And some were very heavy and expensive lawn ornaments. And the plastic ones all looked like they had spent a very long time outside. The neighbor wasn't surprised at all by this. To him, these creatures were devils, and they live everywhere that humans do, woods or not. He thought it was obvious that there are devils among us, and that they would be repulsed by holy representations. I, however, do not agree with this, and though I don't think that to be the case, I do think that's what freaked my dad out the most. He wasn't the type to be particularly freaked out by something like a Bigfoot. I think it would have been more intriguing to him than anything. But once he decided that maybe they're demons or something, I think that's what got him thinking. No, my dad never went to church or anything like that, but I definitely think he was God-fearing, so to speak. But I guess he'd never considered that demons try to get into your house. Literally. Anyway, thanks an awful lot for listening.